Okay, so Civilization 1. Well, it didn't really start there for me. It started a few years before, in fact probably as much as 10 years before Civilization 1 was actually written. And it began for me on the island of Crete, where I was taking a holiday approximately 30 years ago. While I was on Crete, I wanted to take a close look at Europe's first super civilization, which was known as the Minoans. And they were at their height in Crete around about 2000 BC. I've been interested in history virtually all of my life, as far back as I can remember. And ancient history has always captivated me most of all. So I was anxious while I was in Crete, not just on holiday, to discover as much as I could about these most incredible people. If you get the chance to read anything about the Minoans, you will see what an amazing civilization they were. And the very first day that I was in Crete, I was walking down the street, looking in the shop windows as you do, and I saw that. That is called the Phaistos disc. You can't get any idea of scale looking at that picture, but if you think in terms of a CD, a DVD disc, it's just a little bit bigger than that. It's made of baked clay, and it was found in the ruins of the Palace of Phaistos on the south of Crete. It was discovered at the beginning of the 20th century, and it dates back to about 2000 BC. It captivated me the moment I saw a copy of it in a shop window. It was a big blown-up photographic version that I saw, so I could see all those symbols very, very clearly. The Phaistos disc is a tremendous enigma, mainly because we don't know what the symbols mean, and because now we don't know what language the Minoans spoke. Lots of books have been written about the Phaistos disc, lots of theories. Some people think it's a hymn, some people think it's a ritual of some sort. But what fascinated me most about it was that all the characters on the disc are contained within spirals. Now, I'll go on to the next slide, because this is the disc showing both sides, and both sides are different. Some of the same symbols are used on both sides, as if they were symbols indicating words, but nobody knows. The reason that the spiral within which the symbols are found fascinated me is because I already knew, particularly from long walks around my own home in Yorkshire and up on Ilkley Moor, just how important the spiral was to our own ancient megalithic ancestors. And I had read, and I believed it was possibly the case, that to those people, the spiral probably represented the passage of time. It almost certainly was associated with the movements of the sun. There are double spirals, for example, that have been found at Newgrange and other places in the south of England, which seem to indicate our ancestors' ability to understand the sun's movement along the horizon throughout the year. These people were the first farmers. It was important to them to be able to track the seasons. And because the spirals were on the Phaistos disc, something that occurred to me as a possibility was that what we might be looking at here was some sort of calendar. Now, I have to admit, all these years on, that there was a very definite case of intuition going on here, because I had no proof at the time for any of this. But the guy who ran the hotel where I happened to be stopping, I talked to him on the first night, really nice guy called George. Kate and I have been back to see him since, and were able to give him a copy of my first book, because the day after, at breakfast time, he presented me with that, which is my copy of the Phaistos disc, and it's been a prized possession of mine ever since. So I started to look, ruined the holiday, absolutely ruined the holiday, because I started to look at the symbols, couldn't make any sense of the symbols, but the number of symbols and the groupings within which those symbols could be seen quite quickly started to make sense to me. One of the reasons that it made sense to me was because of my interest in calendars. Now, we have a calendar which is based on 365 days, and we add a day every 4 years or so, which more or less keeps our calendar correct with the solar calendar. It doesn't actually. We have to do different things in century years and in millennium years, but we don't have the best calendar that there ever has been, but we certainly don't have the worst. And because we're so technological these days, even minute changes can be made. But because there are 365.2564 days in a year, nobody can have a calendar based on a number of days. Something always has to be done. I was aware that some of the Central American civilizations had used more than one calendar simultaneously, and they'd managed to compensate their calendars, the solar calendar, by using more than one cycle, like cogs within a gearbox. And when they came round to a particular point, they knew that they had to either take off or add a year to the calendar in order to make it come right. And it had also occurred to me that a very convenient calendar might be one that was based not on 365 days, but on 366 days. I reasoned that this was the case because it seemed to me that it would be more easy to regulate, and to take days off the calendar rather than to add them on would probably be a more sensible solution. I noted on the Phaistos disk that one side of the disk contained 123 symbols within 31 groups, and the other side had 119 symbols within 30 groups. That's that. So, let's just assume, as I did, sitting there in Crete at the bar and going nowhere, that the civic year is 366 days in length. It would then be possible to use the Phaistos disk to compensate for the year. And the way we would do this would be, we would count off the number of symbols on the first side of the disk, which has 123 symbols, and we would count those off 4 times, which would lead us to 492 days. If we were to then remove a day from the ritual calendar, it would bring us so close to the actual solar calendar that virtually no other compensation would need to be made for a number of centuries. It therefore beats our system into a cocked hat. The reason that there's a second side to the disk is because the disk runs in cycles of 40 years. 40 was something that I and Chris and I were to come. It clearly was a ritual to our ancestors. Now, we might say, well, okay, so this was around about 2000 BC. What on earth can this possibly have to do with the megalithic people of Great Britain? And that was something that I came to looking at very closely about the time that I wrote the book, The Bronze Age Computer Disk. That was my first book in this adventure, which up until now has lasted for all of my life, because everything else that I've done, everything else that I've studied, relies intimately on what I discovered in Crete. So my first book, The Bronze Age Computer Disk, came to the conclusion at the end of the book that there was a relationship between what the Minoans were doing and what our own megalithic ancestors were doing. This isn't as extraordinary as it might sound. The Minoans were a Bronze Age culture. They relied entirely on what they could make and what they could sell. They were incredible sailors. They travelled all over the Mediterranean, and although there's no absolute definitive proof of the fact, they almost certainly also came through the Pillars of Hercules and up to the southwest of Britain, because the one thing they wanted more than anything else was tin. Tin is one of the components of bronze, and they made and exported goods made of bronze to all parts of the known world. Tin is in very short supply elsewhere in Europe, apart from in Cornwall. So it seems almost inevitable that they would have had to come to Cornwall to get that tin, and that therefore they would have mixed with the megalithic cultures that were in existence at that time in Bronze Age Britain. So, not long after I'd written this book, I got in touch with Christopher Knight. He'd been, this is Chris by the way, he'd been working with Rob Lomas on a number of books, and he'd happened to touch on some facts which I thought were germane to the research that I'd been doing, and so we got together. He and Robert did not write together after that particular point in time, and we found out that Chris and I had one particular thing that we both held almost as sacred in our minds, and it was to do with a guy called Alexander Thom. Alexander Thom was still alive at that time. Unfortunately, such was the length of our research that Alexander had died by the time we would have felt confident enough to get in touch with him. So we never met him, and a year or two later his son Archie died as well. So one of the great sadnesses of mine and Chris's life is that we never got to meet this man. So why did we want to meet him? What was it about Alexander Thom that fascinated both Chris and I? Well, Alexander Thom was an engineer, and he was a professor of engineering at Oxford University after the Second World War. He was a Scot, and he was also a very competent and very keen sailor. He used to sail yachts all around Scotland, in and out of the locks, around the islands. And because he was a man who was interested in almost everything, he found himself being particularly fascinated by the proliferation of stone circles, ancient stone circles, which could be seen from lock sides or from on the islands. And when he was a child, his uncle had given him a telescope, so he was also interested in astronomy. And he looked very closely at the stars and planets, gained a bit of knowledge about them. And in particular, he was fascinated by the phases and movements of the moon. And he wondered, when he looked at these ancient stone circles, whether what these people had been trying to do was to better understand the tides, which of course are heavily influenced by the moon, because he reasoned that there was no way to get about in those ancient times, especially in Scotland, other than by water, really. So it was locks, rivers, coastal navigation must have been the way these people got about, because we know that there were extensive trading links. So because he was an engineer, he decided to investigate this situation more closely, and in his spare time, of which he had quite a lot, he would go off with his family and with a few selected friends, and he started to carefully survey as many of these megalithic structures as he possibly could. It went on for decades. He had, by the time he was too old to do it anymore, the greatest reservoir of information, mathematical, about our megalithic ancestors than anyone before or since. He became known as the father of astroarchaeology, and nobody doubted in the end that he was right in his assessment that a lot of the stone circles in Scotland especially had been used as a means for tracking the moon, which has notoriously difficult movements because it's so close to the Earth, because of its angle to the Earth. Just as an example, Kate and I were looking at the moon last night. If you look at it, if it's out tonight, you'll see that it's quite high in the sky, whereas at the same time on its last circuit, when it was nearly full, it's full tonight I think, or early tomorrow morning, but if you look at it as it was 29.5 days ago, it was much lower in the sky. And it varies a great deal. They needed to be pretty astute, these people, to understand how the moon worked, and therefore how high and low tides were going to be at any given point in time. Now, Alexander Thom was much praised for all of this work, but he was about to announce something which would put a slur on his memory, which has not been lifted since. He was, above all else, a statistician. He knew that the only way we would know anything about these megalithic people was to do many, many different kinds of circles and standing stones and avenues to see where the similarities lie, because only averages give you the truth at the end of the day in that kind of mathematics, because stones move, because they may not have been exactly precise when they were placed there. So on and on his research went until something became inevitable. He found that there was a common unit of measurement. It was 82.966 metres in length, which in old money is 2.722 feet. Now, I'm going to ask my dear wife Kate, who's in the second row, if she will stand up and turn round. Now, it just so happens that from fingertip to fingertip, Kate is exactly 2 megalithic yards wide. So you get some idea of how big the megalithic yard is. And it was really useful. It's one of the reasons why I married her, actually. Because she's been absolutely indispensable on field trips. So we have the megalithic yard. And Tom said there's not a 1% chance of this being a fluke. It does exist. And the Royal Statistical Survey backed him on that, but they said, no, it's much more than that. It's about 99.9% that this is absolutely correct and that it couldn't have come about by chance. Unfortunately, archaeologists wouldn't agree with him. Their logic told them that this must be nonsense, and for one very important reason. The thing about a uniform measurement, a particular measurement, is you have to pass it on from one place to another, from one generation to another, and that's not going to be easy in the Bronze Age. There's virtually nothing you could use which wouldn't change or bend or buckle or twist that would allow the measurements to stay as accurate as they clearly did across 2,000 years. By the end of the megalithic yard being used, it was almost, well, it was exactly the same as it was right at the start. And so people said, no, it's some kind of artifact, something that's dropping out of the mathematics. Now, Chris and I looked at all the information that was available, and we thought this was really, really unfair. And Chris and I also held to a particular axiom. It might seem a very unfair axiom, but I still hold to it, and that is, don't necessarily believe what they tell you. In the end, it's very difficult to say who they are, but it's really important, I thought and still think, that if it's humanly possible for you to do so, you should try and find things out for yourself. I was no mathematician, I was an engineer. I knew a tiny bit about maths, but I didn't know very much. But Chris and I decided together that what we would do would be to set out to find out whether the megalithic yard did exist, and if it did exist, how it could have been passed on from one place to another. There's one of the monuments that Alexander Thom measured. That's Brodgar in Scotland. Right, so what is there? What is there that you can use to define a measurement, to make sure it never changes, and to make sure that you can resurrect it wherever you happen to be at any particular point in time? Long and involved and detailed series of thoughts and discussions and experiments followed. And in the end, there was only one candidate. So let's cut to the chase. It's a pendulum. So, the thing about a pendulum is, when you swing it, the rate of swing is always related to the length of the pendulum. If you lengthen the string, the swing will be different. If you shorten the string, the swing will be different, and vice versa. A pendulum is a beautiful way of measuring things, but you have to have a reference point. You have to measure it against something. So, here we are with our megalithic yard. Now, we think that this is what our megalithic ancestors used in conjunction with the pendulum in order to establish the megalithic yard, and it worked as follows. If you take a braced wooden frame like the one that you can see above, and if you make sure that that frame measures 1/366th part of the horizon from where you happen to be standing, then you have 1 megalithic degree of the horizon. Now, I must explain here. We had come to the conclusion that just as surely as the number 366 had been used in the number of days in the year for the Minoans, that it was also the basis of their geometry and the geometry of the megalithic people. This seems absolutely bizarre to us because we've grown up knowing that all circles must contain 360 degrees. But the more you think about it, the more you realise, no, that's more or less totally arbitrary. We'll come to 360 presently, but 366 is just as useful. It may not be quite so divisible by other numbers as 360 degrees, but we'll see why in many ways it's even better. So, we split our horizon into 366 units. There is a very quick and simple way to do this, but I won't explain that now because the last thing I want to do is swamp you with so many figures that you can't remember any of them. But suffice it to say, if I wanted 1/366 of this circle to the back of the auditorium, I could get that measurement in a minute and a half. So once you've got your measurement, you make your braced wooden frame like the one at the top. You then stand it on a stand, as you see in the picture underneath. You do this in the west, and you do it at a certain time of year, because what you want is to see the planet Venus passing through that gap as it falls towards the horizon. It's only going to work perfectly on a certain part of the orbit of Venus. How they came to understand this is a complete mystery, but it works flawlessly. And if you watch that gap while swinging a pendulum, and you're at the middle of your circle, and you're looking at Venus passing through the gap, then if that pendulum swings 366 times while Venus is in that slot, the pendulum string will be exactly 1/2 of a megalithic yard in length. Therefore, the chord of that, double that, will be the megalithic yard. Now, the amazing thing about this is, of course, is you don't need to pass it on. It's there. You can take your pendulum with you wherever you want to go. There are tiny, tiny differences in the length of the pendulum in the area where Tom measured the megalithic yard. His most northerly ones were in the northern Scottish Isles, particularly in Orkney. His most southerly examples were down in Brittany. And there was a tiny variation in the length of the megalithic yard, and because he'd taken so many measurements, this showed up. That variation is exactly what one would expect if one derived this measurement from a pendulum, and that's because of the nature of the Earth, because of the shape of the Earth, the closer you get to the equator, the more gravity will be coming down upon you. That means that the swing of the pendulum is a tiny fraction different in Brittany than it is in the north of Scotland, and that will make for maybe a millimetre or two's difference in the size of the megalithic yard. But to all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. You can make your megalithic yard wherever you want. So we felt immediately that we had vindicated Alexander Thom. We knew that Venus as a planet has always been of incredible interest to our species. You can look anywhere you like, at almost any civilization you like, and you'll find that Venus has a really important part to play in their symbolism, in their myths, and even in their religion. We tried every possible star and planet that we possibly could. Only Venus can do this. And we think that's one of the reasons why Venus became so revered. We still have no more understanding than we ever had of how they managed to come by that information. But they clearly did. It works. And so it proves that Alexander Thom was correct. So are all the archaeologists who specialise in megalithic things now jumping on the bandwagon and saying this is absolutely amazing? No. Nobody says a word. The last thing that those kind of scientists want is some bum mechanic coming along telling them this kind of thing. But anybody can try it for themselves, and we've tried it literally hundreds and hundreds of times, and it works. It wasn't long before the connections between the Minoan system and the megalithic system started to show themselves. Again, it took a lot of thinking about, but using the calculator, there was obviously a tangible connection. And this was because a guy called J. Walter Graham, who was a Canadian archaeologist, had very carefully measured all the known palaces from the Minoan civilization in Crete. And like Alexander Thom, he'd come to a conclusion that the Minoans had used a particular system of measurement. It wasn't the megalithic yard. He called it the Minoan foot, and it was 30.36 centimetres. So that is the base unit of the Minoan system, and they seem to have used that in all their buildings. But we suddenly found out that 366 megalithic yards is 3365 centimetres, and 1,000 Minoan feet is 3360 centimetres. Now, Graham had far fewer examples than Alexander Thom had, and said in his work that he thought that the Minoan foot might be very slightly different than he'd said, because he didn't have that many samples to go on. The error is 1 part in 6,000. So what the Minoans seem to have used was, if you like, a sexy decimal version of the 366 megalithic yard system. But clearly they were still using megalithic geometry. These two comparisons working together allowed us to reconstruct what megalithic geometry must have been like. Now, we have in our kind of geometry, if you think back to your school days, a circle which is split into 360 degrees. Each of those degrees is split into 60 minutes of arc, and each of those minutes is split into 60 seconds of arc. Megalithic geometry was just very slightly different. Oh, I've stood on something. No picture? I'm sorry, Hugh, but I've got no picture.
Just you have to use this.
Okay, lovely. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Right, so this is what we think, well, this is now what we know megalithic geometry looked like. There was 366 degrees to a full circle, the same as the number of days in the year. Each of those degrees was theoretically split into 60 minutes of arc. And the only difference between this and modern geometry, in terms of the minutes and seconds, is that in megalithic geometry, there was only 6 seconds of arc to the minute of arc. I hope this doesn't get too complicated, because it really is the entire beauty of the system. And this is why. Well, it would be if I could... Oh no, I've ruined the machinery. Okay, so in the meantime I'll carry on and tell you. When we are looking at the Earth, it obviously is a globe. We could split that like segmenting an orange, and we could split it into its component geometric parts. So we could take a segment of the orange that was equivalent to 1 megalithic degree of the Earth. We could split that into megalithic minutes of arc, so smaller segments, and we could split it again into seconds of arc. If we were to do that, we would find out that 1 megalithic second of arc is equivalent to 366 megalithic yards. This is utterly breathtaking. I think we have someone back who can help us here. Okay, so that's how the Earth is split in megalithic geometry. The proof of it can be shown thus. The polar Earth, in terms of megalithic yards, is 48224160 megalithic yards. That is equivalent to 40,009 kilometres. The actual size of the polar Earth, insofar as anybody has an absolute estimation, is 40,007 kilometres. The difference between the two is 1 part in 20,000. In other words, it's the same thing. What does this mean? It means that the whole megalithic measuring system, from the single megalithic yard up, is geodetic. It is based absolutely on the polar circumference of the Earth. And I would suspect that this is the reason why no archaeologist will touch this with a barge pole, because it's just too incredible for words. Are we saying that our ancient ancestors, probably 5,000–6,000 years ago, knew the exact size of the polar Earth? Well, yes, because the whole system is based upon that. And in the end, it goes much further than that. Right, if we make a cube, which is 4 megalithic inches in all its dimensions. Now, let me explain. Alexander Thom looked at lots and lots of little sculptures that our ancient ancestors had made on the stones they assembled, things like spirals, and he measured those very carefully as against the megalithic yard, and he came to the conclusion that there were 2 other megalithic measures. One, he said, was the megalithic inch, and he said there were 40 of those to a megalithic yard. The other one he came across time and time again was a measurement that was 2.5 times the megalithic yard, which he called the megalithic rod. They were therefore 100 megalithic inches in a megalithic rod and 40 to the megalithic yard. So we did a bit of experimentation, Chris and I, and we discovered that if you make a box, a cube, which has sides of 4 megalithic inches, if you fill it with any kind of cereal grain, I've got barley in this one, but it works with wheat, it works with rice as long as it's not hulled, it works with almost any seed grain, you will find that the weight of that equals 1 pound. Now, let's be clear about this. It isn't 1 pound to within 1 or 2 degrees, it's 1 pound. How on earth this could possibly have survived for that period of time, I still find utterly incredible. But we tried it time and time again, and it's absolutely true. And if that isn't fantastic enough, if we get rid of the grain and we fill that same cube with water, then that water will be exactly 1 pint in volume. Again, not to within 1 or 2%, but absolutely. And that comes back to the Earth, because it turns out that whoever designed this system didn't only know the size of the Earth, they knew the mass of the Earth. If we, oh, there's my box, by the way. If anybody wants to have a look at a megalithic cube, that's it. If we now have a look at our segments of the Earth again, we find this. 1 megalithic second of arc segment of the Earth would have a mass of 100 quintillion pounds to within an accuracy of 99.8%. And those kind of symbolic numbers go on right up the line to the full mass of the Earth. And 99.8%, well, I call that pretty accurate, mainly because nobody can give a totally accurate reading of what the mass of the Earth is. We can get pretty close, but only pretty close. So our tame experts, we had on board an astrophysicist who had the social skills of an orangutan, but a brain the size of the sun, and a mathematician whose brain was so big he could hardly get in the room. And everything that we did was passed through these two guys. And if we made a mistake, they told us we'd made a mistake. And in most cases, we didn't. And certainly the information I'm giving you now was vetted by these people. So 99.8%, they said, you don't need to put that in the book. That's okay, that's enough. But we put it in the book anyway, because we wanted people to know. So was all of this restricted to the megalithic people? For example, how did the other measuring systems of the Earth come about? We knew that the Sumerians who lived in what is now Iraq had been pretty bright, and we knew that they'd had measuring systems. So we decided to take a look and see if they were associated with the measuring systems of the megalithic people. So we took a look at the Sumerians. We know that they used a 360-degree circle. Their circle was derived from the corrected movements of the moon, because they used the moon for their calendar. They were sticklers for everything being regular and accurate. They were inclined to round things up and down and compensate later, because they didn't like fractions, they only liked integers. They used a partly sexagesimal, partly decimal system of counting, and they ended up thinking that 360 degrees to a circle was good, not least of all because it's a number that's so divisible by so many other numbers. We know from archaeological data that their base units of measurement, of linear measurement, was called a cush, more commonly used as a double cush, which was 99.88 centimetres in length. If you want to do what the megalithic people did, but using this measurement, then you need a pendulum length of 99.88 centimetres. If you do that, and if you allow that pendulum to swing, in this case 240 times, as Venus passes through the braced frame, then the amount of time that elapses on each beat will be exactly 1 modern second. Now, the seconds pendulum has been important throughout most of history. It was only really abandoned as an ideal unit when the metric system was fully devised back in the 18th century. The only reason that the seconds pendulum was not used as the basis for the meter is because people felt that at that time there was not a clock in existence that was clever enough to measure exactly 1 second. So in the end, what the French did was they divided a quarter of the Earth ultimately into 40,000 for the whole Earth, 10,000 for the quarter of the Earth. They called that the kilometre, and they split that in order to finally get down to the metre. So the metre is a tiny bit different than the seconds pendulum, which, let me reiterate, is a pendulum where 1 swing equals 1 second. Now, all the information that we've dug out on the Sumerians and their measuring system has gone down like a lead balloon with modern theorists, because nobody wants it said that 4,000 years ago the metric system already existed. But it did, and it existed in every one of its facets. So the base unit, the double cush, and we've got to 1 second for the pendulum. So how does that relate to the other measurements? We just have to make another cube. We make a cube that's 1/10 of a double cush, sides, and it holds a litre of water. In this case, they didn't use cereal grains, they just used water, because the weight of water in that cube would equal 1 kilogram. And again, it isn't close, bearing in mind that our starting point is 99.88 centimetres and not 100 centimetres. It is absolutely accurate. Which brings us to this. The Sumerian measuring system and the metric system are, to all intents and purposes, the same system. Why is this not known? Or more worryingly, why is it still denied? Now, I can understand that the French in particular found themselves in a very embarrassing position. At the time the metric system was devised, there was no real knowledge of what the Sumerians and the Babylonians had done. It was only after that time that archaeology started to fill in the gaps. It must have been very worrying to the inventors of the metric system as it gradually became apparent that the system that they'd invented, lock, stock and barrel, was actually 4,000 years old. And once science and scientists take a particular view of something, it can take generations for that to change. They don't like going back. So they invent all sorts of excuses and say that the double cush is not equivalent to the measurement that they used for liquids. But when you really look at the history as far as it is known, it's quite apparent that what we've got here is an integrated system. Now, it's not as clever as the megalithic system, because the megalithic system, because it's based upon the size of the earth and the mass of the earth, is good for measuring time, distance, weight, volume, mass, a whole multitude of things in one integrated measuring system which starts out with that one megalithic yard. The timekeeping methodology of the Sumerian measuring system owes a great deal to what must have come from the megalithic people, but has been distorted because they insisted on using 360 degrees to the circle, so everything else changed in size as well, which is why a metre is bigger than a megalithic yard, and which is why a kilogram is heavier than a pound. But essentially, the methodology was exactly the same. So we'd come to the end of an awful lot of work, and we'd found this amazing system. And we felt that we were almost ready to write our book. But there was one more question that we had to ask ourselves. Were we looking at something which was endemic? Could it be that the megalithic yard, although we'd found a way to measure it and reproduce it, could it be that it was a part of the way that nature functions? We didn't know of any such measurement. There's nothing in nature which is always exactly the same, but maybe we'd hit upon something. And with an eye towards the Nobel Prize for Physics, we decided to have a look around the solar system to see if we could find something that might prove the megalithic yard. We got the shock of our lives. You cannot find the megalithic yard on any of the planets apart from the Earth. You can't find it on any except one of the asteroids, and that is in itself another story. So it's not a unit of nature, it's a unit of this part of the solar system. But no, it goes further than that. It includes the sun, the earth and the moon, and it does so in this way. The moon is 3.66 times smaller than the Earth. There's that number again. Okay, we moved the decimal point, but it's the same number. And the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun. The only reason that solar eclipses are possible is because the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, and because it orbits in a position, when seen from the Earth, 400 times the distance between the Earth and the Sun. So what we see is a line of sight effect. Of course, the moon is infinitesimally tiny compared to the Sun, but it's much closer to us. And it just so happens that when it crosses the face of the Sun, it blots out the Sun exactly, and that's when we see a solar eclipse. Now, because of these measurements, because of the 3.66 times, because of the 400 times, and because of the actual physical dimensions of the objects concerned, we find this. 1 megalithic second of arc of the moon equals exactly 100 megalithic yards. 1 megalithic second of the Sun equals 40,000 megalithic yards. There are no smaller integers involved. These are well over 99.9% accurate, which again, as our physicist and our mathematician told us, are well within what any scientific experiment would have to accept as being genuine. So the megalithic yard doesn't just work on the Earth, it works on the moon and it works on the Sun. So how could that have come about? And that left us at the end of Civilization 1 asking ourselves a question. As intelligent and as wonderful as our megalithic ancestors were, could they actually have come up with a system like this on their own? Would it have been possible for them to know the exact dimensions of the moon and of the Sun, and to be able to create a system that fitted all three of those planetary bodies, well, and the Sun, and at the same time have them work in the way they did? It seemed to us that it was fairly unlikely. So at the end of our book, we were faced with trying to work out how this had come about. Either these people were genuinely incredibly bright, or had there been a civilization in the past that knew as much, if not more, about these things than we know now, and that they had created this system. We had to ask ourselves also, to be fair, whether God could have done it. But the thing is that the moon is absolutely critical to the Earth. We would not be sitting here and standing here today if it were not for the moon. The moon does so much for the Earth that, without going into detail, which is another talk in itself, we could not comprehend that life on Earth would exist at all if it were not for the presence of the moon, and for a whole plethora of reasons. So it appears like the moon was injected into the system, and we went on to write another book, Chris and I, called Who Built the Moon, which you might also find interesting. But in the meantime, we couldn't really answer our own question. We couldn't say why this was the way it was. We just knew it was incredible, and we wanted to tell the world that you shouldn't always believe what orthodox science says, and that if orthodox science won't listen to reason, then there's something wrong somewhere along the line. And I've learnt since that time that this happens in all manner of ways. And all of you who are interested in this kind of subject matter will also know how many people there are in the world that tell you that what you find to be true is not true. But when you can take a calculator and a piece of string and a braced wooden frame, and you can reproduce it in front of anybody, then it's valid, whether or not orthodox science chooses to accept it. There was one last thing which we wanted to know. We had come upon the unit of 366 megalithic yards, but try as hard as we could not find that unit of measurement in any of the stone circles that either we or Alexander Thom had measured. It was a bit difficult, because we reasoned that if they'd known about this unit, which they clearly must have done, then why had they never actually used it? Well, it turned out they did. We just hadn't been looking in the right places. And within 2 months of Civilization 1 being published, we came upon it, and once we started to find it, we found it everywhere. So there we were, in search of 366 megalithic yards. I've just got a few minutes left, and I want to tell you, I once watched a documentary by Dan Cruikshank, who does great documentaries on architecture and so forth. And in this particular programme, he happened to be looking at the city of Bath in the south of England. And he was looking in specifics at a circular structure of Georgian houses, which is called King's Circus. And he happened to mention in the programme what the dimensions of King's Circus were. I nearly fell off the settee because I recognised the numbers immediately. It turned out that King's Circus had a circumference of exactly 366 megalithic yards. Now, I thought, that's strange. It wasn't built by our megalithic ancestors, but it was built by a guy called John Wood. John Wood, in the 18th century, was a foremost member of the ancient order of Druids. He probably also was a very early Freemason. He was utterly obsessed with megalithic monuments, and he'd written a whole book on Stonehenge. So it wasn't long before Chris and I were able to work out that what he'd done is he'd replicated the dimensions of Stonehenge in this particular structure in Bath, which you can go and see. It's amazing. You should hear the echo from the centre of it. Now, so we went back to Stonehenge. He hadn't used the megalithic stones for his measurements. He'd used the ditch and bank. And when we went back to look at many other examples across the British Isles and beyond, we discovered that the megalithic yard was so old that it predated the stones inside these henges. But it was also probably because it's a very big unit, 366 megalithic yards. Tom knew that the megalithic yard was used in the construction of the stone circles, but none of them were big enough to have a circumference of 366 megalithic yards. But the henges within which they were built did. A henge, for anyone who doesn't know, is a circular bank and ditch with one or more entrances. We know they were not defensive because in all cases, except Stonehenge unfortunately, the ditch is inside the bank, which would make them useless for defence. So they were obviously used for something else. And since many of them ended up having stone circles inside them, we can be fairly sure that they were used for astronomy, ritual and probably religious purposes. So once having found this out about Stonehenge, we cast around and we found something amazing, and it was right on our own doorstep. In North Yorkshire, not far from Ripon, is a series of giant henges which are called Thornborough henges. They are so big on the landscape that it is just too incredible for words. You can see the three of them here. The top one is heavily wooded, so you can see it's got trees on it. Then there's a one in the middle, and then there's a one below. You may also be able to appreciate that although they're almost in a line, they're not exactly aligned. And the reason for that is they were clearly built to represent three stars, the stars of Orion's belt. When you take Orion's belt from the sky and you project it down onto Thornborough henges, the fit is absolutely exact. So there's no doubt about that's what they were intending to do. But they did it mathematically correctly as well. Each henge in Thornborough henges is equivalent to 5 times 366 megalithic yards in circumference. The gap between the top henge and the middle henge is 366 megalithic rods. The gap between the middle henge and the bottom henge is 360 megalithic rods. Almost as if they were trying to show that they understood that there were two different forms of geometry. We've never been able to prove that, but we often wondered. But in any case, the second gap would have to be smaller in order to allow for the fit between the three henges and the stars of Orion's belt. It's coming to the end of my talk now. I hope that I haven't bamboozled you with numbers. You can look at the book yourselves. You don't have to buy one. You can get one from a library. It will give you the chance to go back if there's something you don't at first understand. But all I can say is this is an extremely simple form of mathematics. It might not sound that way now, but it is. And we have, when it comes to making the megalithic yard, for example, we've had it done by primary school children. They understand it only too well. So we're not talking about anything complicated, but somehow the most incredibly intricate and yet simplest form of a complete measuring system is at least 6,000 years old. And although no archaeologist or scientist will admit it, it's there for anybody to see for themselves. Whether or not they invented it, our megalithic ancestors most certainly used it and understood it, which makes them amongst the most incredible people who have ever inhabited the face of this planet. We often run away with the idea that those people who lived in the past were less intelligent than us. That is simply not true. They didn't have our technology, but they found other ways to do things. I can only say that for the last 30 years, it has been the proudest achievement of my life to look at these most incredible people who walk the same ground we walk now. Thank you very much.